Sir?
Doing all right. How about yourself?
Thank you.
I'm Jim Ketchum.
Garnet with you. Pleasure to meet you.
Good to meet you. Glad you could join us.
Glad to be here. I didn't know I'd get here. I don't know if I belong here.
I'm a Baptist. I'm not sure I don't. Call that thing a baptism? No.
You're the honored guest. It's like you're honored guest.
I like being in behind the scenes.
It's like being in the spotlight.
Let me turn off my phone.
So the only thing is, I may have to
Yes.
do video.
Yes.
That's fine.
Okay.
I'll just move you over when that's time. Okay. Not to worry.
9 minutes after 4 seems like a great time to begin a 4 o'clock program, I think. I hope you do. My name is Matt Lincoln. I'm the rector here at Trinity. It's a great honor to welcome all of you in the audience and the wonderful panelists here who will all get introduced when you're paying attention to that sort of thing, so I won't go through that now. But it's great for us to assemble on this Tuesday afternoon, 1 week before Election Day. A couple of us have early voted already, so next Tuesday we won't be going to the polls, but it will still be a momentous day. And I have to say, I've been thinking about the subject of white Christian nationalism for probably a couple of years now. I think that's when Rachel Maddow started her first podcast called Ultra about the topic and about its history in the U.S. And I don't know, I'd never sort of heard of it before. And listening to her very well researched, very well presented, very serious presentation on the history of the American sort of branch of the Nazi movement during World War II and before and after. It's not because of the way she presented it, but because of my memory of learning about World War II as a kid in the 1960s. I thought of Christian nationalism as just sort of so far out of the mainstream. Yes, it's there, and it's an irritant, but it's sort of the reason that we're all so grateful that America is the way it is and not like that, rather than it being a part of America. And the history, and so as I listened a year ago or 2 years ago to some of this history as it was presented, I still was thinking of it as sort of fascinating from a distance. It was 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and it's a good thing that it never got any traction, at least not enough to worry about. And of course, America is this great, vast, incredibly diverse place. So of course there are going to be people with different viewpoints all over the place. That's sort of part of what makes America a wonderful thing. But again, I didn't feel that it was particularly relevant to my life, except on principle. Nice to be that sheltered, isn't it? And here we are, realizing that we're not as sheltered as we have felt. So it's really significant, it's really important for us to gather together to take care of each other, to share with each other, to listen to each other, and to reflect deeply on what it means to be beloved community, what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves, and what it means to conduct our civil life not as a place to win a theological battle, but rather as a place to express the love that shapes our lives. It is my privilege and pleasure to say welcome to that discussion here this afternoon. To begin, let's take a moment to ask God's blessing on us and on our gathering. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, you have promised that where 2 or 3 are gathered in the name of your Son, Jesus is in our midst. Inspire us by the power of the Holy Spirit. Keep our eyes pointed in the direction Jesus showed us. Help us to follow his way of love always, and help us to know that when we walk with each other, we walk with you. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm thinking I should introduce Peter Cook. That's probably a good thing to do. Peter Cook is the head of the New York State Council of Churches, and maybe not the only person organizing this event, but the one who's taking the responsibility for it.
And Mayor, why don't we go ahead and everybody else here introduce themselves as well?
Can we be heard from
You
these
should
mics?
be able to be heard. Can you hear them when they talk?
Okay.
Yeah. Talk nice and loud, though.
Yeah. Talk like you want them to hear it, and they will.
Okay.
Can you hear it back there? Okay. Good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Garnell Whitfield, lifelong resident of Buffalo, New York, lifelong member, Durham Memorial AME Zion Church. Reverend Bell is my pastor. My mother, Mrs. Ruth Whitfield, was the eldest victim in the top shooting. Former Commissioner of Fire in Buffalo, and since the shooting, I have been advocating across the country and locally for gun legislation and social and racial justice causes.
My name is Jim Ketchum. I am a semi-retired American Baptist pastor. I say semi-retired because earlier this year I began working for the New York State Council of Churches. I have two primary responsibilities there. One is to help screen candidates who wish to become Protestant chaplains in the New York State prison system. And the other one is, in my role on the board, is I keep an eye on criminal justice reform bills that are floating around or should be floating around. And I grew up in Niagara County, so I recognize some things driving around.
My name is Michael Bell. I'm the pastor of the Durham Memorial AME Zion Church and Outreach Center. I'm a native of Buffalo, New York, having come back to Buffalo 2 years ago from Saratoga Springs to pastor the church post 514. And I consider myself a Du Boisian, a Douglas man, and certainly in the line of Harriet Tubman, I am an abolitionist, and at best, I'm hungry. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be in this wonderful church.
Good evening. My name is Rashida Tyler. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches and the Project Manager for the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative. My policy areas tend to be housing, so I head up the Council's Housing Justice Committee, and I work with the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, helping houses of worship to build affordable housing across New York State. And this is my third time in Buffalo, and I love it each time I come.
Great, thank you. And I'm Peter Cook. I'm Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches. I'm an ordained UCC minister and served in several parishes before assuming this position. We are a council comprised of 7,500 congregations in 9 denominations, and of course the Episcopal Church is one of our partner denominations, and we're pleased to be here today at Trinity Episcopal Church. Amazing. So we do a lot of things around social justice. We certify as chaplains in the state prison system. We really weigh in on legislation, state and federal. We, as Rashida said, really consult with congregations about repurposing their property so they can better serve their neighbors and to flourish in their ministry. So I'm also serve as the principal of the Religious Nationalisms project. And the project is a creation of the Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America and the New York State Council of Churches. And together, these two organizations started this initiative because we saw that different religious institutions, different denominations, different social movements tended to focus on one form of religious nationalism, but often did not appreciate the connection of their particular nationalism to other nationalisms, whether that be Hindu, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, or, of course, Christian. Sadly, we live in a highly polarized political and media environment where different religious groups have very low levels of trust of each other, and they really struggle to speak to other religious groups. Any sort of attempts that we've had on interreligious dialogue have really started to fall apart in our view, and part of the reason we think that's fallen apart is because we tend to avoid having hard conversations with one another. We just want to focus on the fluffy stuff, but when difficult things happen, we don't know how to talk to each other. So our goal is to create a public space in congregations across the country where we can discuss the most controversial and substantive matters related to religious nationalisms when it may be difficult to carry the conversation with just one denomination, church, or organization. And we work with an operative definition of religious nationalism, which is the propensity of a government to adopt a religion, whether that's Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, or Judaism, and twist that religion to undermine democracy and suppress the voice of religious minorities and many other kinds of minorities, and also to suppress the voice of people who share the same religion but have a very different understanding of that religion, which was adopted and twisted by the government. We use a lot of sources, but one reference that I would like to commend you take a look at are 3 statements which were approved by the National Council of Churches at their governing board, which is comprised of 36 denominations. The first one 3 years ago, on Christian nationalism, and just a week ago, they approved a new statement on religious nationalism, and also the Hindu nationalism and the persecution of minorities in India. So we work very hard as a Council of Churches to encourage the National Council of Churches to adopt particularly the religious nationalism and the Hindu nationalism statement. And it's really a major contribution, we think, to the public conversation, and I commend them to you. You can find it on our webpage or at ncc.org. The week before the election, up to November 24th, we will be focusing the project on one of the nationalisms, Christian nationalism, and we'll be holding 4 seminars or events in New York, Batavia, Buffalo, Binghamton, and the Riverside Church in New York City, and also attending seminars and events in Columbus, Ohio, and Springfield, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and Cincinnati, Ohio, and we're also paying a visit to Springfield, Ohio. And I think we have somebody in our audience who actually is from an Episcopal church in Springfield, Ohio. So that's really great. We thought it would be really good to take a look at the question of Christian nationalism in the heat of this political moment, right up to the election. So as we do these, and by the way, we've already done seminars in Nashville, Atlanta, Chicago, and also outside the United Nations. So we will just continue to be doing these for the foreseeable future. As we do these seminars, we are learning as we go. So our first basic learning is that before we can talk about any nationalism, it's really best first to describe that faith tradition's positive characteristics, which can then be used to evaluate how a nationalism is distorting that faith. It's easier to see what's happening with these nationalisms if we have some positive understanding against which we can measure these Christian nationalists. In that spirit, I want to share with you a few thoughts about the positive attributes of Christianity, and then I'm going to invite the Reverend Michael Bell, pastor of the Durham African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, to amplify. So if I may, Christianity places, obviously, Jesus at the center of our conversation. And Jesus draws heavily from Jewish teaching to make his case. The Shema of the Jewish faith is represented by Jesus, for when he is asked, what are the two great commandments, he said, first, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second is this, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. These two commandments are based on the law and the prophets. Loving God with our whole selves makes clear that we have one allegiance to the living God and that we mustn't be tempted to distort our love by loving other things, worshiping false idols, the proverbial golden calf, whether that be guns, money, power, race, or any number of other things that I'm sure you could think of. And then we also are called to love our neighbors. Loving our neighbors is about much more than loving your actual neighbor who is sitting next to you in the pew or in your apartment building or in your neighborhood, although it is about that. But it's also about loving our neighbors who are different religions, different races, and from different countries. Loving our neighbors means loving undocumented immigrants. It means loving people who are incarcerated. It means loving children. It means loving people of different sexual orientations. It means loving atheists. It means loving people supporting candidates who we don't like. There are abundant examples in the Bible about how we put these great commandments into action. For instance, the story of the Good Samaritan, where the Samaritan, who is an outcast, demonstrates how to love one's neighbor without question, much to the consternation of religious officials. Or Jesus, after refusing to be tempted by the devil, who offered him all the kingdoms of the world if Jesus worshipped him, gave an inaugural address where he said in the synagogue and read from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And for his words, the town, maybe they were nationalists in their own right, sought to throw him off a cliff and kill him for his words. So, at this time, I would like to invite Reverend Bell to amplify a little bit on the positive attributes of Christianity and what he sees in terms of his own experience in pastorate. And I've heard you, talking about Du Bois and all these wonderful people as well. So.
First of all, I want to thank you for showing up. I'm just a little curious, just a couple of you, why are you here? Why are you here? Would you stand up so all of us could hear?
Because I wanted to show them, people are people. I don't care what color they are. They can be purple. I don't care. You can see that because of the way he was raised. I saw on TV Kennedy killed, Martin Luther King killed, Malcolm X killed. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? I'm like, people all living in hell. And now I feel it's back. And it's worse than it was in the 60s. And I'm here to get information and help my neighbors to stop it.
Thank you. Can I have one more, and then I will respond?
My name is Julie. I'm a teacher, and I teach middle school Spanish. Just the other day, the kids stood for the pledge to flag. You can't force them. I don't force them. But one kid stood, and then he did a Hitler salute. I was so nauseated. It was 26 years of teaching. It was shocking. So, yeah, that's why I'm here.
The amazing reality is that the scripting that we are all experiencing has been here basically from the beginning of time. If I look at that first century on up to about the 3rd century, the Christian church was never monolithic. It was a diverse group of people that had different expressions of what it meant, but Christ was always the centrality that unified the whole of the body, even if there was tension and disagreement, and it was a very powerful force. By the time we get into the 3rd century with Constantine, now the church had grown tremendously, and if you can't beat them, join them. And Constantine at that particular point takes the church and elevates it to a position of power, which the church had never had political power, secular power before. And after that, the conciliar movement now became a group of people that when it got out of hand, it led to the killing of a lot of other people just because they did not consent with a particular way of looking at things. It created a we and a them. Sociology said that they outgrouped groups of people, but behind all of that was the politics of a new nation and the birthing of a new nation that now, fast forward, whether the 15th century where Spain picks this up and Ferdinand and Isabella now comes over to the States or sends people over here and they end up in Mississippi. You didn't think that Mississippi now was the first group here from Europe because Great Britain wouldn't acknowledge that. But fast forward to 1619, or beyond that. And what we begin to realize up through the Civil War, after the defeat of the southern states, we began to see when Lincoln put the federal troops around that there were groups of people that resented it. And out of bitterness of having lost, we find that that was never really dealt with. And what was a war criminal now gets dismissed. And groups that during Reconstruction that formed, such as the Lost Cause, the KKK, and the rest that were used to intimidate, to keep minority groups from becoming or having an important role in the governance, particularly after Reconstruction when black people in South Carolina became legislative people. And let me just fast forward this, that during Reconstruction or after Reconstruction, there was a point in Oklahoma. See, we think that when we got to January 6th, that it was the first time that a state capitol had been run over by a mob that was criminal, and they pushed the Constitution aside. Didn't I call them 45? Didn't 45 want to do away with the Constitution? There are groups of people that continue to do that. January 6th is another example. And so when we get to a point where the Christian church now is asked, who is it? Whether in Buffalo, I grew up here in Buffalo, so I know what you went through in the 60s. I'm not sure if it was worse. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we have a long history in this country of not dealing with what appears to be difficult issues for some and impossible issues for others, and not doing the right job. And whatever it is, we have not done the right thing because we continue to be inundated by hate crimes. 2 years ago, in Michigan, the governor of Michigan was almost kidnapped. And if it had not been for the FBI that was on the case, the governor then would have been kidnapped by people who were white nationalists, people who just had a basic disagreement, because these were people that believed that diversity mattered, inclusion mattered, immigration mattered, all of those things that become so substantively important when we start talking about the eschatological Jesus and what it meant to be in a multi-ethnic environment that the Bible and the New Testament and the Old Testament had always talked about. And the corrective that Jesus makes is a corrective where many within various Jewish tribes just did not accept it as well. And so the corrective that Jesus makes, as well as making in the garden when he's getting ready to be executed, and Malchus has his ear cut off by Peter, who happens to be a disciple of Jesus, who takes his sword and cuts off the ear of Peter. And the idea and the image that Jesus now is referring to is that it must not be this way. That just simply means that the new kingdom does not come by military power, military might. So our interpretation of what it means to defend oneself in the Second Amendment is suspect with regard to what George Washington really meant and giving guns to militia, not necessarily giving guns to everyone, because there were only 5 issues. There were only 5 issues back then, and one of those issues was Great Britain, Spain, and France. Another issue were Indian raids, and then the last issue, the 5th one, it was no more than African revolts, slave revolts. And so if you've gotten rid of all of these other issues, it's just about using guns against black people, minorities, the others. Who's not in the group. And the trouble is that we're looking at this whole dilemma being scripted by power and magnified so much so that the individual in suburbia or the individual in rural America is now oblivious to the amount of chaos that's in their own backyard. But as long as they have a gun, it's okay. Stay out of my business, no matter if our children aren't educated to better standards, no matter if we can't get what they claim elites are doing through urban areas. Well, the urban people have been exploited for years. We wouldn't have what we call donut hole communities. I come over here across Main Street, and after being away for 29 years, I'm looking at Buffalo sometimes entirely different. And I say, okay, Main Street was the great divide between, and so because I passed it all over New York State, I've got a tremendous history of what this state looks like post our first constitutional convention that left black people out. And in 1700 to 1744, white people were allowed to kill us, and you want to talk about immunity, qualified immunity. Well, that's today's version of the same law that was written on paper, and it wasn't written by us. Nor did you get our permission. And nor could you ever get God's permission, because if God created everything, God is the only one that can restore everything. And that's out of the church's hands, that's out of the government's hands, and it certainly is out of my hands, because God has too much work to do and I've got enough. Okay. So I just want to say from a positive Christian lens, we have been inundated with a situation and a condition. And it's amazing. I'm walking into this beautiful church, and I was wondering, would I stand up by that pulpit, that lectern over there, with the eagle on it, and actually talk? And as much as me and Benjamin Franklin had a problem with that eagle, I just have to say that I probably would have stood over here and not gone over there, just because of my conviction that predatory bird is not my image of righteousness, not my image of what we need to be doing. And because I'm a dissenter, that doesn't make me anti-American. And we have to get over that, because America is too large for me to ever dissent anything that God has created. This is a wonderful, beautiful place, but that it has become sectioned off as to who benefits from it and who doesn't. And so what is our role as Christian? I think we're here today to say we are stronger together than we are divided. And if there's anything about going back and looking at our origins, it wasn't the garden activity where Adam and Eve, one blames the other, that became the problem. The problem was how Satan got into the garden and divided them first and foremost. Because both within the union are to make sure that nothing divides, because all of our rituals are the same with regard to not allowing anyone or anything interfere with that union. And both of them did. Both of them did. And as long as power will always divide and conquer, we have to do better as a church to recognize the schemes that are bigger than any one of us, that have been doing it for a long time, whether here in this union or over in Europe or in Africa or in Asia. We've been doing it all over the world, but we are stronger together. And so I thank you.
Thank you. We're going to look at three pretty vivid examples of how Christian nationalism works. And the first one we're going to talk about today is replacement theory. And to explain what replacement theory is, I'm going to play a video. Can you go over it now? We're going to look at two videos, and then we're going to ask Mr. Whitfield to speak.
Late in that I knew which roads there was also.
Everything is over my head.
This story begins like every science fiction movie you've ever seen. I've got a couple out in the desert.
It's not really a surprise that the guy who live streamed himself shooting people last week in Buffalo believed some racist bullshit. But that racism was dressed up in something called the Great Replacement Theory, which is as dangerous as it is preposterous. And it's very preposterous. It's the same theory these guys were stomping around about. The Great Replacement Theory is a conspiracy theory, meaning everything I'm about to say is not true. Those who believe it claim there's a sprawling, coordinated effort to get people who aren't white to, you guessed it, replace white people. There's an old and pretty well-known history of white people believing this type of thing. But the phrase Great Replacement came from a 2011 French book that argued immigrants were coming to Europe to eventually extinguish the white race. Many white supremacists in the US had already worked each other up about the idea of white genocide when this theory came along. Pretty conveniently, it gave them a way to blame Jews for orchestrating their inevitable demise. Again, very not true. But this idea has been showing up in a bunch of mass killings. In 2018, the killer at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh had posted that Jews were to blame for bringing non-white immigrants and refugees into the US. He killed 11 people. The guy who killed a person at a synagogue in California in 2019 posted something similar. At the mosque shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, the killer's manifesto was called the Great Replacement. And at the 2019 shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, the shooter's manifesto also referenced the theory and claimed there was a, quote, Hispanic invasion. This extremely dangerous idea is catching on in American politics. A fact that at one point might have surprised you, but now is more like, yeah, that checks out. When former Congressman Steve King tweeted about how you can't restore civilization with somebody else's babies, that's replacement theory. When current Congressman Matt Gaetz talked about an attempted cultural genocide, he even used the word replace.
There is an attempted cultural genocide going on in America right now. The left wants us to be ashamed of America so that they can replace America.
And there it was, when the House's now third-ranking Republican was talking about immigration.
No good management has come from the Biden administration when it comes to the southern border. This has been an invasion.
The current favorite version of this theory among conservatives is that non-white immigrants are moving in and Democrats are pulling the strings. President Trump and his supporters have helped spread this by saying the 2020 election was swung by a horde of undocumented immigrants who somehow managed to vote illegally. Again, Not true. But now, this theory that seems like it would only be in the darkest corners of the internet is very much in the mainstream. A recent poll found that about 1 in 3 Americans believe a powerful group of people is conspiring to replace them with immigrants to win elections. And that has been reinforced by heavy air quotes here, the news.
I think it's pretty clear, they're not even hiding it, that the whole point of their immigration policy is to ensure political control, replace the population, get a different outcome.
These are future voters. They want to bring in as many as possible, change the voting rules and regulations, provide amnesty, and get these people voting.
Democrats who want to replace you, the American voters, with newly amnestied citizens.
One thing people who believe this point out is that by 2045, the number of white people in the US will be less than the number of non-white people. That's true, and is something people have been talking about for decades. But there's a big difference between being outnumbered and being replaced. And what most conservatives seem to want you to believe is that this completely natural shift in demographics is a long-played plot against white people. That's exactly what you can watch for as we barrel towards midterms. Politicians and pundits finding sneaky ways to squeeze in the racism of the Great Replacement theory, all the while assuring you they're not actually racist. But racism, explicit or not, always has consequences. Because what exactly did the 10 Americans who were killed shopping for groceries in Buffalo Saturday morning have to do with any of this? Nothing. Nothing at all.
And Rashida, if you could show one other clip, brief clip. This was filmed Saturday night.
There's a hidden 5-minute credit trick that millions of Americans are using to send their scores soaring. Have you tried it yet?
You know, there's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah, I think it's called Puerto Rico. Okay, all right. Okay, we're getting there. It's absolutely wild to see. And in Texas, stuff is really crazy. We're right there by a wide open border. Where are my proud Latinos at tonight? You guys see what I mean? It's wide open. There's so many of them. It's absolutely incredible. Believe it or not, people, I welcome migrants to the United States of America with open arms. And by open arms, I mean like this. It's wild. And these Latinos, they love making babies too. Just know that. They do. They do. There's no pulling out. They don't do that. They come inside, just like they did to our country. Republicans are the party with a good sense of humor.
Prove it.
You know, there's a lot going on.
So with that not so pleasant introduction, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you. As you might imagine, this is very personal for me, very personal. I make no apologies for it, so forgive me if you would. Just to go back to the beginning when Reverend Bill asked people to tell them why they're here, and I know you said that you had grew up in the 60s and you recognize currently. Yeah. But yes. But it sounded to me like there was a period of time when you might have thought, hoped that this was not the case, and now you recognize that it has reared its ugly head again. Well, I just want to tell you from my lived experience, it never left. It's been here the whole time. It's never gone. It's never left. It's been here the entire time. That's been my experience. You heard the theory of the race replacement theory. Makes sense on the surface. It makes sense that people would do anything to protect their privilege, to protect their place of domination, to protect all of the things that have allowed them to prosper. It makes sense. But I've seen it up close. And having seen it up close, it didn't make sense to me. I never understood where the passion, where the rage was coming from. I've never seen it before. And my understanding of the race replacement theory takes another step. And it says that not only are they worried about being replaced, but I think the passion and the real fear, what really drives them to be violent, is they're afraid they'll have to take my place. They're afraid they'll have to live under the conditions under which they've made me live.
Right.
They see themselves in my shoes. That's where the fear comes from. That's where the desperation comes from. And that's the real truth of the matter. And so that's my theory of the race replacement theory, is that they don't want to live like us, like those others that we talked about. They think that when we come into power, when the demographics change and they're no longer in the majority or no longer in power, that the same things that they perpetuated against humankind down through the years will now be done to them by those in power. And I've had to fight against this my whole life. I've been the Commissioner of Fire, Assistant Commissioner of Homeland Security in New York State. I've had positions of power and authority. And that same fear was demonstrated by those who knew they had treated people inappropriately with the power they had. And then they were afraid that I was going to use my power to subjugate or to hurt them. And I have to explain to them, that's not what I believe in, you know? Because I do believe, I am a Christian, I do believe in God. And so I've had to fight against this my whole life. People assuming that when you come into a power, you're going to treat them as they have treated others, but that's not the case. So I think that's something that's not talked about. And I think that's where the fear, that's where the real passion and fear comes from, that makes these people do anything. Certainly they don't want to give up their privilege. But I think if we were only talking about leveling the playing field, there would be a different response, if that's all we were talking about.
The one good thing that you come out of the 60s, she's my daughter, I taught her and my son. You accept people as they are, do not judge them by their words, by their actions. And they are both very easy going with anybody.
But it comes back, it still comes back to, we have two decisions that are typically made. The first decision I think that Brother Whitfield was talking about was that we have been taught in this country that violence can make it go away. And the proliferation of violence has been part of the custom here, but that's only one end. The other end is, and as a student of King, that we all can make a difference from a legislative or cultural position to say this isn't tolerated and cannot be tolerated because it's a hate crime, and sometimes we have to come back and take a look at maybe how we have created, and the Justice Department is guilty of this just as well, okay? How we've created loopholes for hate crimes to just disappear. So when I'm talking about the situation in Michigan, I'm also talking about how the federal government and how the state governments have really not put that information out to let us know how often this kind of behavior is actually perpetuated, and we are left to kind of pull it together and piece it together when it's been more prevalent than maybe how often we eat cold cereal for breakfast. And so we get continuation of this, whether on 514, because 514 didn't start at 514. Millett Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Law Act September 29th in 1850, and I sit back and look at people who are fragmented, not just from what happened at 514, but are fragmented through our courts, through the fact that we have left communities in distress, and they've lacked equity, they've lacked a lot of things. And we are all benefactors of some poison that's impacting all of us, rich or poor, black or white.
I mean, there's this misnomer, this belief that working through the systems such as they are, that we can make these changes. But the truth of the matter is these systems were never set up and designed to facilitate equity, to facilitate equality. That's not what they were designed to do. They were designed to subjugate. They were designed to separate and divide us. And so unless we're willing to talk about the systems, I mean, the foundation of the things that we're talking about here, whether it's America or whether it's the church, whatever it is, unless we're willing to go that far, then there is no solution on the horizon for any of this. I mean, it's naive to think that a system that was set up to subjugate you or to divide you is the system that you're going to find freedom in. Mm-hmm. It's not designed for you to be free. That's not what it's designed to do. So we have to, and that's not saying throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying that at all. Foundationally, there are things we can all coalesce around that is, that we could agree on, that we would believe in or whatever. But we have to have a discussion beyond the obvious. Beyond the obvious. I think it's, Hebrews, right? 11 and 3. In the third verse, it talks about that, talks about the foundation of the world was framed by the word of God, such that everything that did appear was made up of something that did not appear. And we've got to look beyond what we see and look underneath these things and have those kinds of discussions. And so I'm thankful for the audience. I'm thankful for having this discussion, having this audience, because the hard conversations, as you said when we started, are what we've got to be willing to do. Not in a judgmental way, but just in an honest way.
Thank you. So we'll have plenty of time for a robust conversation, but I'd like to lift up for you two other dimensions of Christian nationalism. And the next one I want to chat with you about is sort of the principle or the history of the separation of church and state, and the notion of hierarchy, which is very present within Christian nationalist thinking. So I'm here with my Baptist friend over here, who should really be the expert on separation of church and state, but if I could just give you a little personal history. I served as senior pastor at the Plymouth Church in Framingham, Massachusetts, which was founded in 1701, about 75 years before the American Revolution. And if you are in New England, and particularly Massachusetts, you could not establish a town until you formed a church. And so, and the role of the moderator, that's a term for Congregationalists, was to moderate between the town meeting and the church. And the church pastor was paid with taxes. And you attended that church. But God help you if you were a Baptist or a Quaker or any other religious minority because your church wasn't getting any tax money. And so it's interesting that in 1740, there were some Baptists who were attending the taxpayer paid for church who said, you know, we're kind of sick of this. You know, we have something called the First Great Awakening, so we're going to form our own Baptist church. So they did that on the green, just a little farther away, but they really struggled to make a go of it because they had to come up with all the money to run their church. They weren't getting, you know, government payments to do this. So that kind of floundered, and then in 1820, with the Second Great Awakening, we saw what was called the Unitarian and Congregational split, which basically said that, well, it was a Trinitarian position where one pastor at my church said, well, they got to keep the building, but we kept the faith. And he did this with quite a flourish, you know. And but it really was a blessing because at that time they really pulled the plug on state support of churches, where every church really was on their own and had the freedom to practice as they saw fit and to be able to be critical of the government without being tied to the government. It's interesting to me and ironic that many Christians today who were persecuted under my church's Christian nationalist regime, namely a lot of Baptists, are now rather eager to assume and ask the government to establish their religion over everybody else's. So, Jim?
Let me begin by saying that I normally introduce myself as being from the American, no, not that kind of Baptist church. Much of the troublesome things you've been hearing about that Baptists believe are directly tied to the Southern Baptist denomination. American Baptists, we cover a broad range. We have some people that are pretty right-wing, some congregations, and some that are quite liberal. But you know, Peter's right. There was a tremendous concern in all the other states besides Massachusetts first of how are we going to set up this country so that we don't have what Europe had, the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the Crusades. Every time in history the government has been in charge of a religion or vice versa, thousands have died. It's that simple, that plain, that straightforward. The government has no business telling me what I must believe or how I must worship. And by the same token, I have no business forcing you to believe as I believe, or you to worship as I worship. I think that the church is in a much healthier position when we've been in the minority in terms of being able to critique the powers that be. This was a radical idea. Roger Williams, who American Baptists claim as originally a Baptist, founded the colony of Rhode Island when he was thrown out of Massachusetts Bay Colony because he was preaching things that the Puritans didn't like. And he spent years going back and forth between Rhode Island and England, petitioning the king. He made a total of 6 voyages that took 6 to 8 weeks each way to get a charter that said there was no church in charge. And Rhode Island became a center where Jews could live without being hassled. Quakers could live. It just astounds me. The Quakers are such a peaceful group, but if you go back in American colonial history, they were jailed and executed just for being Quakers. They were not part of the established church. They were not part of the majority. They were different.
So, thank you. So, we think it's really important to have that historical view, and we have one particular Christian nationalist formulation which really appeals to the government to reinforce a white hierarchical view of what Christianity is all about. Men, slaveholders, are kind of at the top, kind of what maybe we call slaveholder religion, and they have a lot invested in maintaining that social order and controlling women, people who were slaves at the time, now people of color, controlling people who have different sexual orientations, controlling anything that they perceive is going to threaten the family as they define it, and they really get super invested in this. So, you know, things like focus on the family, this image of the family becomes really a form of discrimination. And I want to lift up for you just a thought, which is that you will have a chance to vote on Proposition 1 on November 1st, the Equal Rights Amendment. Listen carefully to the opposition to that amendment. We're afraid that if you make it law, we can't any longer discriminate against transgender kids, or we can't control women's bodies anymore, or we can't take our elderly people for granted, or we will have to treat immigrants equally by virtue of the Constitution. And it is a pitch battle right now out there, folks. And I'm not telling you how to vote, but I am saying that we should be paying attention of how Christian nationalism works in the arguments that you hear around that proposition. So,
two things I want to point out about that. One is turn your ballot over. Proposition 1 is on the back of your ballot. No, not anymore? Oh, it's different county by county. Thank you. Yes, yep, that makes sense.
You got to flip it in New York City.
Yeah, and you got to flip it in Albany and Rensselaer County too.
Yeah.
But
anyway,
the other thing is when I listen to the arguments being made against this proposition, I do not understand where they got those ideas from, and they're spreading like wildfire. That schools are going to be able to change your daughter into your son during the school day without you knowing anything about it.
Yeah. So
the list is very much into domination of thinking that this is so far out that we can't possibly.
Yeah.
And it's not that far out. It says everyone is equal. Everyone should be treated equally.
That's no different than how white communities were treating black communities,
yes,
or black persons, that led to the death or murder or the lynching of black people who were just I might have glanced at you, and I was subject to be hung. And it was better for me to hang than for me to ever look at a white woman at all. So the language of fear-mongering and the language of absurdity really addressed a fundamental lack of education by an audience. And so when you're talking about whether we're talking about the Puritans that really scripted the slavery in America, and if I could point to a very dominant culture of people that organized schools and organized a lot of the thinking through the religious circles in earlier colonial America, it was them. It was Puritans, Cotton Mathers, and a bunch of others that did a lot of the scripting. And at the end of the day, this is how a culture of people came over from Europe who had just written the slave Bible in 1807. And we see that if they're willing to change what we call as sacred just to perpetuate a system that was somewhat perfected by the Romans, the Greco-Roman era, they're copying a lot of things that had already been done years before. And so the whole domination of race or domination by a hierarchical system, no wonder it took Susan B. Anthony so long and Katie Stanton so long to overturn. Do you know where I'm going with this? Okay. And so I don't think that we've resolved that issue yet. That issue is still a very big concern when we take a look at domestic abuse. And if I take a look at the eugenics movement, you still have problems of domination that really victimize, whether they were poor white children, girls, the Carrie Buck situation as a classic case in point, or what they did with to control the ability to procreate by putting so many black people in prison. And that's another issue.
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely related.
Okay, so Rashida, I'm going to now kind of focus on the third piece of this, which is really looking at how this operates in Buffalo and public policy, and kind of from your chair as you go around the state. Rashida, by the way, is on the reparations task force for Senator Sanders right now, so she's very immersed in these questions around reparations. But to share with us a little bit about her impressions, particularly as it translates into public policy. And then she's going to invite all of you to reflect with us for the remainder of our time.
So I think today we've really heard about the different ways that domination and control are exerted by those who are identifying as white male Christians. You have one, which is force, right? So if I can't have my way or I feel threatened, I'm going to use weapon or force to go out and to vanquish what I think is a threat to my identity. One of the other ways that happens, and it doesn't have to resort to force, is through our laws, through our policies. If you go to any law school and open up a textbook, on the very first page, usually in property law, you're going to see something that says the purpose of law is to maintain the status quo. So maintaining the status quo means for many people who have been oppressed, maintaining the systems that have oppressed them. So through our public policies, we've seen the common examples that are obvious and have racism imbued in them. We've seen redlining. We see obvious housing discrimination. We see where there's a criminalization of those who were suffering from addiction during the crack cocaine epidemic and those who were suffering from addiction in the heroin opioid epidemic, and how there's a different treatment. That decision of how something is determined to be a crime, how it is policed, how that is enforced, comes from our lawmakers. And our lawmakers are often enforcing or upholding the systems that, as Mr. Whitfield so rightly said, were never meant to actually function as mechanisms of freedom or to even to get to equality. They're meant to enforce the status quo, peace, in terms of not disrupting the current social order. And so we see policies around the state, through zoning, that every municipality has a zoning board, and zoning started here in Buffalo. But it became a mechanism for enforcing racial segregation, and a way in which no one had to say, I'm going to separate whites from blacks, even after court decisions said redlining was outlawed. You don't have to say that anymore. You're just going to restrict lot size. You're going to restrict setback. You're going to force a person to build a building that is innately more expensive. You're going to restrict single-family zoning. You're going to make your neighborhoods such that the cost of building excludes many people. And so that is a way of enforcing this segregation and this control without even having to say, hang a sign, no blacks, no Latinos, no anyone who doesn't meet these measures. And so in many communities across the state, we're seeing right now lots of fights occurring over housing. Housing is one of the great equalizers, right? So if you're living in a certain neighborhood, that determines the school you're going to. It determines who your neighbors are, who your everyday connections are. And that has a lot to do with our identity. And so by controlling these mechanisms such as housing that touch us on a daily basis, they're actually controlling the ability of communities to form and to come together and to gather in spaces outside of, church, school, these kind of organized spaces. And the reason those interactions are important is because when you look at Brown v. Board of Education, so taking it all the way back to Brown v. Board of Education, one of the reasons that the court decided to integrate schools was based on the harm to white and to black children. So they looked at how black children were not, interacting, or they were getting a bad self-perception of themselves. But they were also looking at white children who had an incorrect worldview, a worldview that centered themselves but was not realistic. And so when you don't come into contact with people of other cultures and other races on a daily basis outside of these organized spaces, you begin to form a sense of identity and self that is not necessarily in touch with reality. And so our social policies and our public policies reinforce that. One of the things that I, it's a side note, but looking at how we became white, how we became black, how we became these races in America, those are social constructs. And there's a whole body of law at the beginning of the century where people were suing to be determined to be white. And they had to go to court to say, I have this heritage, that heritage, these are my physical characteristics, these are this. And the court system played this role in enforcing who's white, who's black, who's color, in between. And so that kind of system, when your identity is placed on something that is so tenuous, you become threatened when you see someone in your space who doesn't match those characteristics. And so when I think of replacement theory, it implies that you had something that someone else is coming to take. And so if you are white, or perceive yourself as being white, but whiteness means I have access to these schools, these jobs, these whatever these markers of success are, or markers of what I view as whiteness are, but yet you see someone who's black or brown in that space, that is it's a mismatch between your perception. So your identity becomes threatened, and then you turn to violence or finding ways that are absent violent to enforce the separation, which is public policy. So I was talking with Reverend Bell a few weeks ago, and this is happening all around the state where people are reevaluating their expressways. You know, knowing that that came out in the 1960s and trying to keep, you know, white and black neighborhoods separate. You know, here in Buffalo, that's, you know, prime example. And I know policy solutions are out there, for better or worse. Policy solutions are out there, and those conversations are starting to happen. How can we correct course? How can we dial this back? But there are other ways and other things that are current where, you know, where this oppression, where this segregation is still occurring. It happens in who gets a grant, who gets a building permit, who gets, you know, recognized and elevated into certain positions based on your proximity or based on your who you know. One of the things I'm going to say is social networks tend to be homogenous. So if you know the right person, most likely they're going to be of the same race as you. And so that also limits opportunities and limits who's in these positions where people are appointed and their mindset and their worldview when they're starting to make decisions. So with that, I'm going to ask everyone here to think about Buffalo, to think about your communities, and to think about how this oppression or racism or exclusion expresses itself in Buffalo today. And I'll give everyone a minute to think about that. And it's okay, this is really honestly a very safe space to just be honest.
And you're free to react to anything else you've heard as well in this presentation. You've heard a lot of things. So we have, you know, a good 35 minutes to have a conversation. So, yeah.
I appreciate the various points of view out here today. They're not all the same, which should be a lesson for us. And what concerns me is that the easy one is the race one. And my understanding is that's not why we're here today. It's Christian nationalism, which embraces the race thing and it's much bigger. And here we are in a church, and the one common factor between myself, who's scared to death about the kind of behavior that we're seeing in politics right now, the difference between me and the guy who is the white nationalist is grave, but the similarity is really important. It is Christian. It is the center of a religious belief, whether it's Christian or Hindu or anything else. All of us together have a commonality that we're just forgetting right now. And if you look at what's being said today, the phrase that gives me chills is the enemy within. The enemy within came from McCarthyism. It may have been existing before, but it was popularized by McCarthy. McCarthy's lawyer was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn is the lawyer for the Trumps. Donald Trump has embraced that teaching as a young boy to a point which is terrifying. He doesn't limit it to black-white. He limits more what some others of you were saying, which is it's the other. And it would be a shame and it would be naive. And it doesn't take away the tragedy of the racial disparities. And by the way, I disagree with you when you said that the law books and the law is to maintain the status quo. That's not true.
Well, that's what they say.
No, it's not true. You misunderstand it. The law can be created by statutes, which is more or less the feet in the clay thing. But we develop our laws through history and case law. So in the property context, which you were talking about, that law has changed. And the big one was a case called Pruneyard Shopping Mall. It was some kids came in and they wanted to send out little bulletins and stuff, and the Pruneyard people threw them out. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. because you created a public space. And since that case, we've, all the way up till the spring, the United States Supreme Court said, oh no, property is really different. If your zoning administrator says no to this or that, that's a taking of your property rights. I guess I'm naive when it comes to the law, I believe in it, but the one that I believe in more is the likeness of Christianity. And for them, then, here I'm doing the same thing, to co-opt the word Christian nationalism is just wrong, and we're just doing nothing about it. We shouldn't be railing against it, we should be saying, you and I have something in common here. Here it is. It's up to us to show what's similar and not up to the people who are showing the differences.
I did just want to say, I think we can agree that Christian is something that's being co-opted. And that when you talk about Christian nationalism, we're talking about people who have an ideology and are utilizing Christianity as a vehicle to populate or to that identity. Right. But what I'm going to say around law, and this is just coming from someone who was a first-year law student and opened up her law book, and it's right there in black and white. The purpose of the law is to maintain the status quo. That is what is being taught. The purpose of law and how we are living is that we have a body of laws that are meant to be equal, meant to have a structure and provide that structure, and it builds upon itself. And so in that way, it does maintain a status quo. Law does change, case law goes back and forth, but the structures that are there are the same. And that's the intent.
I might just add also, just, the kids passing out the literature, there was a law, I can't name the law that you referenced about the kids passing out the literature and it being a public space and they couldn't throw them out then. Right now, if I go to the Galleria Mall, I will be followed. Yeah. I will be, looked at differently than the other people there. So there's laws on the books, but they're no good if you don't enforce them and if you don't abide by them.
And that was the trouble with that was the trouble with Constantine doing what he did. So the Christian space got co-opted, and then the church became a problem. And then when we start talking about law, there is much to say that the Christian church has always been subversive to the status quo, that the Jesus ethic was never to be subordinated to the ego. The cross always stood higher than the flag, but Christian nationalism says just the exact opposite. And it also says, whether in Louisiana or Alabama or Maine, that this is a white man's nation. And that's the problem right there.
Hi. So, I will be happy to do that. I just want to share something that I struggle with. My wife and I have lived in 5 different states, and primarily in suburban or upper middle class neighborhoods. And I struggle with the fact that I can do that and stick my head in the sand without any consequences or accountability of what's going on around me if I choose. And there are times that I do choose and times that I don't choose. But I heard you say something about that nature, and I'm just pondering this and asking if there are anything we can do about that from an education standpoint, from a policy standpoint, or something. I feel like I need to be more accountable to the fact that I can just drive home to the outskirts of Springfield, Ohio, or wherever, and not A, care, or B, feel accountable for the things that are happening there. So,
Thank you so much for your honesty in saying that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you an example that within the state of New York, you know, we're working on something called the Faith-Based Affordable Housing Act, which basically says that to communities that you have to be, if you have a religious institution that wishes to build housing, and at least 20% of that housing is affordable, that you can't restrict their zoning to be able to build that. And what we're discovering is that that is just evoking a firestorm that from many, well, frankly, suburban communities who are very vested in having a certain kind of housing to maintain the social order, and their zoning boards figure out lots of clever ways to not adjust the zoning. And it's all very arcane and kind of cloaked in legalisms, but it is a way to basically, you know, maintain a social order. But we have people in all of our communities who have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing, including a lot of these suburban communities, the people who pour your coffee, who, you know, clean your toilets, who teach your kids, who, you know, 50% of New Yorkers are in that kind of situation. So one of the things I think we can do living in those more privileged spaces is to really engage the zoning question about, we want lots of different kinds of people to be able to live here. And it's hard, and it's the perimeters around Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and Albany and I know in Long Island just resist this heart and soul.
Well, Long Island's been taken before, that's why it's
Yeah. I don't know if I'm speaking at all to what your question was, but it's just to say that, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's just for us to pay attention to what's happening in our location, you know, instead of, oh, well, you know, that's kind of what's going on over there.
And I think one of the other things you can do, and oftentimes people think I have to do something grand, I have to join a campaign, I have to, you know, run up in City Hall with a bullhorn, whatever it is. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be that way. You can have a conversation with your neighbors. And I think that actually is more effective. And one of the things that get comfortable being uncomfortable, the conversations that are viewed as divisive, those are the conversations you should be having, but learning to have them in a way that we're not tearing each other down, or we're not, you know, closing doors on our friends and neighbors, but that we're provoking these conversations, talking to your friends in all white spaces and saying, well, why does our neighborhood look like this? Why aren't we having, you know, a more diverse community? And not shying away from it or viewing it as divisive, but you have to start piercing that veil before it ever evaporates or before it ever comes down.
Well, I'll just say one other thing just to bring it home. Why is it that my children who used to live in this neighborhood can't live here anymore? They have to move away. They can't afford to live near their parents anymore. And they're going to leave your church and they're going to go someplace else. You know, and I mean, it really, and what nationalism does is it others people, and it makes it sound like, well, you know, my rights are being protected if I can discriminate against others. When in fact, when you discriminate against others, it hurts you, you know. It hurts your soul, it hurts your pocketbook, it hurts your neighborhood, it hurts your church, you know, that depends on being able to have a diverse, economically diverse even group of people who sit there on Sunday morning.
And then it gets masked in such words as communism, liberalism, socialism, stupidity. Okay, and I have to say this. You might not agree with me, but Jesus could care less which ism you're a part of. The idiom is to love your neighbor as yourself. Darnell?
No, I wanted to thank the gentleman that spoke previously for acknowledging and for being convicted in his spirit, for understanding. Because for me, and I agree with everything you said, before 5/14, before my mother died, I have to acknowledge my complicity in my false sense of security, being comfortable in my life, and not speaking up and not getting out and not doing this work before then. Not until my mother was murdered did I get up. But this is how change occurs. Conversations, people's hearts and minds, legislation, policy is all good, but change occurs in the hearts and minds of people. So the people that you are in contact with every day, you have power and influence with them, and that's what we're doing here today, is sharing and having honest and open conversations, and I think that's what we have to be willing to do. So I just wanted to say that.
You talk about conversation. I want to highlight an opportunity that's right here in Buffalo. I am Catherine Lincoln, and I'm on the board of Gardens Buffalo Niagara. It's the organization that sponsors Garden Walk Buffalo, the big garden walk that was started now 30 years ago.
Can you turn the mic a little closer to your mouth?
Sorry.
You're echoing.
Yes.
The big garden walk, how's that? That was started 30 years ago, but it was on the west side. That great Main Street divide that we all know is here was highlighted. In 2017, the board realized we can't do this anymore. And we launched in 2018 the East Side Garden Walk. It's an opportunity to have conversations. I am on that committee, and I am proud to serve on that committee. It's the weekend before the big one. It's not the same time. There's problems with that too. But it was started by 40 brave gardeners who were willing to open up their gardens. After the Tops Massacre, we made sure that the Tops Honor Garden, when that was built, that is on there and starred on our map every year. The Jewish Federation has run a bus for the last 3 years, I believe, to see East Side gardeners and visit with them. And we make sure we start and go by and acknowledge the Tops Honor. And it's an opportunity to share in conversation about the beauty of the world, about creativity, about hard work and labor, and about things we have in common right here in Buffalo. And a lot of people don't know about it. And so I wanted to be public here and say it's an opportunity to help bridge those divides that are, yes, indicative in racial issues and white nationalism and white Christian nationalism. But it's an opportunity to share with someone that you might never know. And I talked to a woman from Trinity just the other night who went on the 2024 Jewish Federation sponsored tours and Trinity's involved in that too, and she had found out about it. And she said, my gosh, I had the greatest conversations with people, not only on the tour with her of the East Side Garden Walk gardeners, but with the gardeners themselves. And I get that over and over and over again. So it's an opportunity, and we hope to grow it. 40 gardeners in 2018. We had over 100 gardeners in 2024. So
great.
Conversations are happening, and bridges are being crossed on that great divide, and maybe one day it'll be all one.
I want to thank you for that, because after all my travels in various places I've come to pastor, one of the central things that I've noticed, not only was there very limited narratives of how black people lived in various communities, but we had to do a better job at not allowing the voice of the status quo to dominate the narrative. But we have to find, Pastor, interactions between us so that we can create new narratives that become part of a dominant. And the reason I'm saying that is because in Saratoga Springs, where I came from before here, we had a situation that occurred where the zoning board wanted to eliminate many of our social ministries in that area. And as we met together as clergy, I can remember that meeting very clearly. Everybody was shocked when we got the note from the zoning board about them taking us to court to suspend all and to stop all of our pantries, and said that all we want you to do is make room for your choirs and your little Bible studies and that. And I said, go get the lawyer that's most suited to write this. Take the case from Troy, New York, that happened such and such at, how do you know that? Never mind. And so you do that, and then when they report back, you're going to find out how much we value that First Amendment right of religion. And it was punitive. See, that's the one thing that's missing in the hate crimes. I see the one boy that just got 30 years, or got a life sentence for trying to kill Nancy Pelosi's husband in January 6th. That's the one thing we haven't done is, and I'm not a big supporter of all that punitive stuff, but we haven't been firmer about putting that out on Front Street like they do black people. O.J. Simpson, Bill Cosby. I'm not saying they don't deserve it. I'm just saying that, okay, where's the equity in here? Okay. So at the end of the day, I said, this kind of narrative is what people have to make a difference in their communities, but you've got to be able to create a new narrative. If this is a new day, then let's make it a new day. Let's find those creative narratives that really are showing not just the bridges, but that change is real and possible. Did I tell you that Garnell Whitfield, because of everything, he's going to be running for mayor? Did I tell you that?
This was a campaign stop.
Thank you guys for everything. This has been super informative, and just thank you. But to answer Rashida's question that you posed before about how does this oppression express itself in Buffalo, I would definitely agree with the housing. I'm an older millennial, but still technically a millennial.
Same here.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I always wondered like why some of my fellow millennials were kind of turning towards this white nationalism, being like, didn't we learn anything? But anyway, I do think a lot of it is fear from like housing, because I know myself, I'll be honest, I benefited greatly from generational wealth. That is the only reason I'm able to have a house. And, you know, I feel that, you know, we're all kind of struggling, especially our age, you know, our generation, just trying to hit those milestones. And it's so easy to be like, well, they're taking the opportunity from me.
Right.
But I do find on a good note, when we all actually talk together, regardless of race or creed or anything, we're like, hey, this system kind of sucks. Like, maybe we should work together and, you know, reform it. And I do feel like those conversations are happening, even on a small scale. At least a little bit at my house, we have a lot of game nights, and we have all different kinds of people come, and we'll have those conversations, you know, over silly games, but, you know, still, it's good to have those conversations and realize just how much we have in common and the similar problems.
Right.
I do also think that, at least for myself, I mean, I would say I was very, you know, I went to good schools and everything, but it was so eye-opening, especially when I moved out here and joined Trinity, just how little I knew, like, about, like, I had no idea about Tulsa, Red Line, and any of that stuff. And, you know, I went to, not to do just, like, advanced history, and he never mentioned any of it.
Right.
And just, it's so eye-opening, just all this history that we're never taught. And it makes the world make, I mean, sadder, but at the same time makes it so much more sense. And actually, I did have a quick question, as you can tell, I'm a note taker here. You mentioned Conrad and the Slave Bible of 1807.
Yes, Slave Bible of 1807,
Yeah.
Great Britain. Yeah, they produced one.
They produced?
Yes.
Is
yes.
that something, because...
You can Google it.
I can Google it, okay.
Yeah, you can Google it.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I got that right.
That was the one that was missing a certain chapter?
Yes.
A certain book of the Bible?
They rewrote things, and they wrote it in such a way that slavery was God ordained.
Okay.
Which required an awful lot of rewriting of Exodus.
I would say so, yeah, okay, well, I'm definitely,
Yes.
And thank you all so much for this.
But I always go back and challenge the languages because, you know, one of my obsessions with language that's dominated some of our biblical texts have been culturally sensitive to maintain class order. So you would read words like obedience, obey, and that would be enforced more than faithfulness, which engages your will and more of your person. But obedience is, you know how hard it is to say to a wife, obey your husband today, without chuckling?
But yes. And running.
I'm just giving you years of dealing with language and all that stuff that goes along with it.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
And cultural bias.
And one of the things in New York State, so I chair the faith-based reparations committee for Senator Sanders, and we're doing a lot of the backwork for the state commission. It's not out yet, but I think on November 12th, the state commission for community reparations is coming to Buffalo.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't know if they put that on their website yet or not, but they're going to be here. And they have a website so you can look it up and get all the specifics. But their purpose is really to hear from the community. One of the things that isn't well known is the role of the faith community, the role it played in slavery. It played a huge role in its abolition. The Baptists had a lot of grassroots support in helping to abolish slavery. But there were churches that had slaves in New York State. That the Trinity Church Wall Street was built by slaves. And churches that didn't own slaves directly either benefited from the endowments of slaveholders or in some respect benefited from slave labor that was in a secondary capacity. The state benefited from it as well. So
Who built the ships? Northerners. Who owned the ships? Northerners.
Right.
Who kept the money from the slave trade?
Right.
New York. New York City.
Wall Street.
So we're
Wall Street,
asking the
which
faith,
was also built by slaves, not the Dutch.
so we're asking the faith community really as part of the reparations process to engage in the state reparations process because the commission has about 13 months right now to basically compile all this information and to start making recommendations to the governor on how reparations will look in New York State. And this conversation really should be led by the faith community. You know, there are many churches who have started to make reparations in one form or another, but reparations is not only cash. It's not only in that respect. And so, yeah, it's not only cash. There's multiple ways to make reparations. But one of the things that we need from the faith community is involvement and in helping to shape that.
And I'm on that commission.
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
Waiting for orders.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you, just like everyone else has been saying. Because coming today, I was having the feeling that back before the election of Obama, and I went to a church, I was searching for a home with my kids, they were little at the time, and we went to this church that was my friend's church, a Protestant church, and they were basically telling their people at the church who to vote for. And I was really upset and shocked. And I'm still feeling that way today, that was how many years ago? And we're still here, only it's almost worse. We thought we were making progress, and then I don't understand how that church was allowed to say to their people, without saying the name, don't vote for this person. I was so sickened that day. And that was how many years ago?
There's almost no case brought against a church for politicizing, for political activism like that, has the IRS touched, let alone ruled against them. So it's in the law that you can't be partisan as a religious organization, but it's not enforced.
And then as a teacher, this is a friend of mine who still goes to that church.
Yeah.
So it brought me back to when that kid stood up and did that salute. What do I do? And I guess from what I'm hearing from you is just keep saying that's not okay.
Have you talked to your friend about your reaction?
No, that's a hard conversation that you're saying we need to have. And
that's a risky conversation.
thank you for encouraging me to do that. I don't know if I'm brave enough, but
maybe wait till after the election.
Right. But I think thank you for the encouragement to try to have that conversation. It's baby steps at this point, but those steps become bigger steps. It starts with a step, right?
I think we have to decide what it is we value. You know, what is it that we value? Is that friendship, that relationship, more important than your peace of mind, or than you being who God would have you to be? And I think it's just a simple question, actually. What is it that we value? And if you're not willing to put those things at risk, they're probably not worth having in the first place.
The truth of the matter,
you know what I'm saying?
The truth of the matter is, from our very founding, whether blue or red, neither one of them actually brought us and delivered the goods that we would hope. Okay, it was more about protecting a system of elitism that, we spend 53 cents on a dollar for militarism. And much of that money that goes to support 800 military bases around the country is not necessarily the benefit by those bases, but the economic benefit that money is laundered through to some very elite people, because the margins are so large. We are consensually, we have been slaves of a system, black and white, with whites not necessarily understanding the role of a slave that you play for generations. And that is a significant a problem, and the reason why the Poor People's Campaign became so powerful in 1967, 68, and in resurrecting it now to even have an earthly consciousness attached to the three woes, it becomes important for us to realize that what we're fighting over isn't just black and white, but it's about maintaining a perpetual culture with the exclusion of the rest of us. And so the question that should be asked is, who's entitled to the benefits of the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Is it we the people? So if I slip and say who you should vote for, please understand, as a history here in America, I refuse to not say something about an individual that's going to dress up like Andrew Jackson and do what Andrew Jackson did. Shame on me. Now, we vote for the lesser of two evils.
What I will say about friendships and personal relationships, because I know those are difficult in navigating it, is in having these conversations, because we're mirroring the kind of conversation we want to have as a society. It's not winner take all, zero, we're battling to the end here. This is my perspective, this is how I felt, this is what I believe, and this is how I felt in that moment. And if your friendship is an open one, or one that, trust, that friend's going to take that. She may not agree with you, but it's not going to be, well, I'm never going to talk to that person again, but we're modeling it's okay to have difference, it's okay to have a different opinion without going to extremes. And I think that if we can do that on a personal level, we can do that on a societal level. And I have hope that we're going to get to that place.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, thank you.
I want you to know how much I appreciate this conversation, because I too go back to the 1960s, and I remember it was the Berrigan brothers, Jesuits, it was Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the church as such, or people involved in the church at a leadership level were very active in doing exactly what you said Jesus did. Jesus was a countercultural figure. He was in opposition to the system. And what I have noticed in the last bunch of years is that I don't see the church at all leading. I see church people sexually abusing children. I see church people in fraud, taking money, everything that is not what you expect. And I sometimes think, where is the moral leadership in this country?
Yeah.
If it isn't in the church, if it isn't from y'all,
right.
I don't know where it is, because we're not getting it from the political.
Yep.
So I'd like to see that revival again of those times. Those people, if you see those, that picture of King leading a march, everybody in that first row have the collar on. They were the leaders, and the nuns in the old habit.
Right.
So I want to see more of this, and by God, take the courage and go.
You are welcome you're welcome to join us when we go to the state capitol to lobby for these things.
For what things?
For criminal
housing
justice,
policy, for
housing policy.
Absolutely.
I can join you on some, but I'm not so sure about how do you call it?
Reparations.
Reparations?
Reparations, because you got a whole lot of people who would be in line with you. And they might be a different color, but they experience that kind of thing at a different level for their ethnicity, for their religion, etc.
Right.
And that's a tricky road to take. That's all I'm going to say. I understand, but I also understand that's, to me, that could lead to division. It has to be done carefully.
Well, so what I'm going to say is division is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be destructive. It doesn't have to be negative. It's a prompting to a conversation. If you feel it's divisive, the question is why. And if
I'm
that,
sorry, you have to
oh, I'm so sorry. If you feel it's divisive, the question is why. And that why becomes, how can we repair? How can we repair if this is something that I feel doesn't involve me, or this is something that could be divisive? There are lots of things in our culture that are divisive, but we have to start putting those threads in to knit things together.
And that's empathy, and it's you and me together. You and I look at each other and see ourselves.
Right.
That is such a feminine trait.
Isn't it?
Do you think we could really learn that?
All I can do is I can pray for you to do that.
Can I just say one more thing in the end?
That guy at the Madison Square Garden got the memo on that.
Okay.
I got you.
I wanted to say one thing about the myth of white nationalism that's not talked about. And it's almost like the plague that follows them, but no one says anything. In 2022, there were 47,222 murders, gun-related murders in the United States. And of that 47,000, 54% of them were suicides.
Yes.
And the great majority of this, and by the way, only 7% of all of that was black related. Only 7% was brown related. 6% were Asian, okay? Now, how does that change your perception? Second of all, 54% was white related. And of that 54%, the great majority of them came out of rural communities, and they were poor white men. So when I take a look at MAGA hats, no one is actually talking about, do the math over a 10-year period, what has been epidemic in an area, and because my research has been particularly in the area of policing across the nation, I wanted to find out, is there any legislation? Who's following this? It's quiet. No one talks about it. So when I talk to the sheriffs, when I talk to police chiefs, and I say, how often have you gone out there? This is what's happening. The great majority of them are saying, oh my God, I've been going out there, I've never put that together. Because from a sociological standpoint, there is an era of suffering and a lack of honor that's assigned and shame, and so there's no relief. The curse is that they've been abandoned, and no one says a thing. Not the religious right, their godsend, or the left. What a wonderful day to be exposed. Because I'm saying this not in a harmful or punitive way, but perhaps we will be able to find ways to pull them into the center of the struggle and to see how close and connected we are with the 514s and with others that have gone through some demonstration of what it's like not to be human.
And may I add, you men ought to sit down with each other and discuss what it is to be a man.
Especially after 55.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are just a few minutes past 6, and we should try to close this. So I really want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Reverend Lincoln for opening up this space, and to all of our panelists. And this is what churches do, right? They open up spaces for public conversation. So you're in, that's one thing about those busybody Puritans that I have to apologize for again and again. They did, you know what they called their sanctuary? They called it a meeting house where people could come to talk about stuff.
Right.
And we've lost that sense of the public conversation. So that is a segue for me to briefly say that this is not the end of the conversation, this is the beginning of a conversation. We want to invite you to go to your congregations and ask them if they would host an event like this. Think about how you might reach out to across a racial divide and have these conversations in different places, to also reach out to people of different faith traditions who also suffer and feel a lot of alienation, and have that conversation. And we'd be glad to bring the project back, next spring maybe, for, part 2 and part 3. So thank you. I want to encourage you to show up in your community and listen, be present, go to places that you wouldn't ordinarily go to a school board meeting, go to a zoning meeting, go to a protest, walk in your neighborhood, listen, become politically engaged. And this is something that we all need to do, acting on our baptisms. It's not something that the pastor does, or the two crazy people in your church who are on the social justice committee. This is something we all kind of do together. Please vote. If you see something, say something. Speak out, speak loud.
Speak often.
Pay attention to Proposition 1. Study that. Talk to your neighbors. Think about it. And then you can go to our website. We update our website daily with updated events, and you can check that all out. And then also our Religious Nationalism Project page and anti-racism resources, nyscoc.org, New York State Council of Churches. And we have resources. We will have a video of what we've just presented here up on that page for you to look at. And then we invite you also to come to our gala on the 14th of November in Albany. We recognize actually some leaders who emerged out after the top shooting at our gala 2 years ago, and we'll be recognizing some important people this year. And finally, this is just kind of a end thing, that we really want to encourage you to sign your church up for community solar. You can save 10% off your church's electric bill. Plus, you can share that benefit with all your homeowners and renters, and when they sign up to get 10% off their bill, the church gets $100. So, 30 parishioners, $3,000. And I had some things in there that you can sign up to do it. It's very, very easy. It does not cost you anything. It actually saves you money and makes money, but it also helps to save the environment. It's called Community Solar, and it's there. And then I guess my last pitch, she's reminding me, is our Ecumenical Advocacy Day is on the 4th and 5th of March in Albany. We'd love to have you come to Albany, but we also want to encourage you to put your legislators on speed dial on your phone and get to know them right here. You don't have to come to Albany to start having conversations with these folks.
But what you mentioned about faith leaders being in the public sphere and leading, this is what we want to build again. Going across the state, encouraging. So much suppression has happened around the faith community and involvement in the public sphere, and a lot of secular organizations have taken over that work. I crossed over from the secular activist sector, so I know we were doing a lot of this work, but faith leaders are so important, and your voices are important to faith members of the faith community, leaders in the faith community. Come to Albany and don't shy away. And feel free to express yourselves on anything that is in the public realm in terms of public policy. That's where your voice is needed. And so March, I believe it's 3rd and 4th.
Oh, 3rd and 4th.
March 3rd and 4th. But you can head to our website.
I knew we brought you along for a reason.
Basically the 2 dates, and we help you in terms of learning how to advocate, how to speak to your legislators. Never feel any type of fear to do so, or that you can't do it because of IRS rule or something. You can advocate, you can talk to your elected officials, invite them to your services, invite them in. Literally, I know all of my elected officials, and they know a healthy way that I'm going to talk to them about whatever need is in the community. And you should have that access too. You put them there, you can feel free to access them.
Invite your state senator to church Sunday. And have a conversation afterwards. So there you go. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hi. Oh.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh.
It's hard.
Sorry we couldn't